The cook served his own food, and the lady apologized. Chapter 1. The Iron Kingdom. The rain hammered against the windows of Le Paradis, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where reservations were made 3 months in advance and a single meal cost more than most people's monthly rent. Inside this temple of culinary perfection, every surface gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, every movement was choreographed with military precision, and every dish was a masterpiece of molecular gastronomy that prioritized visual impact over emotional connection. Dame Victoria Ashworth adjusted her silk scarf as she surveyed the dining room from her corner table, the same table she had occupied every Thursday evening for the past 7 years. At 62, she was the most feared restaurant critic on the East Coast. Her reviews in the prestigious Manhattan Culinary Review, capable of closing establishments within weeks or launching unknown chefs to international stardom. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her designer glasses reflected the ambient lighting, and her expression remained as cold and calculating as a surgeon's blade. The waitstaff moved around her with the reverence reserved for royalty, their movements careful and deliberate. They knew that Dame Ashworth noticed everything: the temperature of the wine, the angle of the silverware, the precise timing between courses. She ate with clinical precision, her pen never far from reach, ready to document every flaw, every misstep, every moment of imperfection that would later be dissected in her ruthless reviews. In the kitchen below, separated by steel doors and a world of difference, Elias Rodriguez wiped sweat from his brow as he plated another perfect composition of deconstructed lobster thermidor. The 34-year-old sous chef had worked his way up from dishwasher to his current position through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to execute the head chef's impossible demands. His hands, scarred from countless burns and cuts, moved with the precision of a watchmaker, arranging microgreens and foam with tweezers under the unforgiving glow of heat lamps. The kitchen was his prison and his sanctuary. Here, among the controlled chaos of searing pans and shouted orders, he could lose himself in the rhythm of service. But tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the letter from home tucked in his back pocket, written in his mother's careful handwriting, telling him about his father's declining health and asking when he might visit. Perhaps it was the way Dame Ashworth had dismissed his previous creation with barely a glance, her fork pushing around the carefully arranged elements as if they were debris to be cleared away. "Order up for table 7, Elias called out, sliding the plate across the pass. He watched through the kitchen's small window as it made its journey to Dame Ashworth's table, carried by a server whose hands trembled slightly under the weight of expectation. The critic examined the dish with the intensity of a gemologist, studying a suspicious diamond, her face revealing nothing. The kitchen held its collective breath. Even the dishwashers paused their work, steam rising from their stations like incense in a cathedral. This was the moment that defined careers, the pause before judgment was rendered. Dame Ashworth lifted her fork, took a precise bite, chewed methodically, and then set down her utensil with the finality of a gavel. Her expression remained unchanged. Neither pleasure nor displeasure crossed her features. She simply moved on to the next course, leaving Elias and the entire kitchen staff in a limbo of uncertainty. It was worse than criticism. It was indifference, the kind of professional dismissal that suggested his work wasn't even worthy of commentary. The head chef, Marcus Beaumont, appeared at Elias's shoulder like a spectre. "She's not impressed," he whispered, his French accent thick with concern. "We need something extraordinary for the final course, something that will make her remember why she started writing about food in the first place." Doom. But as Elias looked up at the order board, seeing the final dish they had planned, an elaborate dessert construction that would take 45 minutes to assemble and cost more than his weekly grocery budget, something inside him began to crack. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his skin, reminding him of everything he had left behind in his pursuit of this cold perfection. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. The final course preparation began with the mechanical precision that had become Elias's signature. Liquid nitrogen hissed as he flash-froze delicate sugar sculptures, while around him the kitchen maintained its ballet of controlled urgency. The dessert, Memories of Childhood according to the menu, was an ironic masterpiece of artifice. Chocolate soil made from cocoa powder and cookie crumbs, edible flowers that had never seen real earth, and a sugar glass dome that would shatter dramatically when tapped with a spoon. Dame Ashworth sat in her corner like a judge, awaiting final arguments. She had already photographed each course with her professional camera, the flash illuminating her table in stark bursts that reminded everyone of her power to immortalize or destroy with a single image. Her notebook lay open beside her plate, filled with observations written in her distinctive angular handwriting. The restaurant staff moved around her peripheral vision like ghosts, afraid to disturb the critic's concentration, yet desperate to anticipate her every need. Elias felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him like a physical force. 7 years he had worked in kitchens like this, climbing the hierarchy through pure determination, sending money home to his family in El Salvador, while living in a studio apartment with 3 other kitchen workers. 7 years of burns, cuts, 16-hour days and dreams deferred. All for moments like this, when his work would be judged by someone who had never held a job that left her hands permanently stained with grease and hope. The sugar dome cracked under his torch, and for a moment, Elias saw his reflection in the fractured surface, distorted, fragmented, barely recognizable. His mother's letter crinkled as he moved, and suddenly he could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "Mijo, remember that food is love. Everything else is just showing off." The words hit him like a revelation. When was the last time he had cooked with love instead of technique? When was the last time he had made something that would comfort rather than impress? The dessert before him was beautiful, complex, intellectually satisfying, and completely without soul. It was everything Dame Ashworth expected, and nothing that would touch her heart. Marcus appeared beside him again, his chef's coat pristine despite the chaos around them. 5 minutes until service, he announced, but his eyes narrowed as he studied Elias's expression. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Elias stared at the elaborate construction before him, then at the ticket that would send it to Dame Ashworth's table. The kitchen around him continued its orchestrated dance, but he felt suddenly separate from it, as if he were watching from a great distance. The letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, reminding him of everything real he had left behind in pursuit of this artificial perfection. "Nothing's wrong," he said quietly, but his hands had stopped moving. The other cooks glanced over, sensing the shift in energy. In professional kitchens, hesitation was dangerous. It disrupted the flow, broke the rhythm that kept the machine running smoothly. But Elias couldn't shake the image of his mother's face, weathered by years of honest work, her hands permanently stained from the small restaurant where she had fed their neighborhood with simple, hearty meals made from ingredients that cost less than a single edible flower on his current creation. She had never attended culinary school, never learned molecular gastronomy, never heard of liquid nitrogen or spherification. Yet every dish she made carried something this perfect construction lacked entirely. The timer for the final component chimed, its shrill note cutting through his reverie. Around him the kitchen waited. Dame Ashworth waited. The entire trajectory of his career waited on his next move. He reached for the plating tweezers, his trained muscle memory ready to complete the performance. Instead, his hand went to his pocket, feeling the worn edges of his mother's letter. In her careful words, she had described the simple chicken soup she had made for a sick neighbor, how the woman had cried with gratitude, how food could be medicine for both body and spirit. "Real cooking," she had written, "comes from the heart, not from books." Elias set down the tweezers and stepped back from the pass, his decision crystallizing like sugar in cold air. Chapter 3. The Act of Rebellion. The kitchen fell silent except for the persistent hum of refrigeration units and the distant clatter of dishware. Elias walked away from his station, leaving the elaborate dessert half-finished under the heat lamps. Marcus followed him with his eyes, confusion creeping across his features as his sous chef moved toward the walk-in cooler with purpose that had nothing to do with the evening's planned menu. "Rodriguez, what are you doing?" Marcus's voice carried the sharp edge of panic. In the dining room, Dame Ashworth was finishing her wine, her expectation for the final course growing with each passing minute. Delays were unacceptable, especially when the critic had the power to close restaurants with a single scathing paragraph. But Elias was no longer listening to the head chef's increasingly frantic commands. Instead, he was gathering ingredients that hadn't seen the light of this kitchen in months. Simple yellow onions with their papery skins still attached, carrots that weren't baby vegetables cut into precise geometric shapes, celery stalks that bore the honest marks of field growth rather than hydroponic perfection. His hands moved with a different kind of precision now, guided by muscle memory that reached back through years of professional training to the small kitchen where he had first learned that cooking was an act of love. The other cooks watched in fascination and horror as Elias commandeered a small saucepan and began to heat oil over a gentle flame. This was culinary heresy in a kitchen where every dish was composed according to Marcus's exacting specifications, where improvisation was forbidden and tradition was something to be deconstructed rather than honored. "You're making a mistake," Marcus hissed, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. He had worked with Elias for 3 years, had seen him execute impossible dishes under crushing pressure, had watched him climb the kitchen hierarchy through pure skill and determination. This wasn't the behavior of someone having a nervous breakdown. This was something else entirely. Elias diced the onions by hand, his knife work fluid and confident. The simple rhythm of blade against board seemed to calm something deep inside him, connecting him to every cook who had ever stood before a flame and tried to transform raw ingredients into comfort. He could hear his mother's voice guiding him. "Not too hot, let them sweat until they're translucent. Taste as you go." Basic techniques that no culinary school had needed to teach him because he had learned them at his mother's elbow, watching her feed their family and half the neighborhood with whatever ingredients she could afford. The onions began to caramelize, filling the kitchen with an aroma that was both foreign and familiar in this temple of molecular gastronomy. Several line cooks had abandoned their own stations, drawn by the unexpected warmth of the smell. When was the last time this kitchen had smelled like a real kitchen instead of a laboratory? Dame Ashworth's server appeared at the pass, looking increasingly nervous. "Chef, Table 7 is asking about their dessert course," she announced, but her words seemed to reach Marcus from a great distance. He was staring at Elias with the expression of someone watching a carefully ordered world begin to collapse. Elias added the carrots and celery, then reached for ingredients that existed in this kitchen only as components for stocks and reductions. Dried beans that would normally be pureed into foam, herbs that would typically be distilled into essences, simple spices that would usually be combined in molecular suspensions. He was making his mother's lentil soup, the dish she had fed him during childhood illnesses, the meal that had represented safety and unconditional love when the world felt too big and frightening to navigate alone. The kitchen staff had gathered in a loose circle around Elias's improvised station. Some looked scandalized, others curious. A few seemed almost relieved to witness this act of rebellion against the relentless pursuit of technical perfection. They watched as he added the lentils, as he poured in simple vegetable stock instead of the clarified broths that were their usual standard, as he seasoned with salt and pepper and the kind of intuitive tasting that no amount of culinary training could replace. The soup began to simmer, and with it something fundamental shifted in the kitchen's atmosphere. This wasn't about impressing critics or earning stars or maintaining their reputation as purveyors of impossible cuisine. This was about the oldest human act of hospitality, sharing food that nourished both body and spirit. Marcus made one last attempt at control. "You're going to ruin us," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could smell the honest warmth rising from Elias's small pot, could see the way it had drawn his entire staff into something approaching reverence. Elias looked up from his stirring, his eyes meeting Marcus's with perfect clarity. "Maybe," he said quietly, "or maybe I'm going to save us." Chapter 4. The Moment of Truth. 20 minutes later, Elias ladled the simple lentil soup into a plain white bowl. Not one of the restaurant's signature black porcelain creations, but a basic ceramic vessel that looked almost humble under the dining room's crystal chandeliers. No garnish adorned the surface, no artistic oil drizzles or microgreen arrangements. Just soup, honest and unpretentious, steam rising from its surface like incense from a humble altar. The dining room had grown restless. Dame Ashworth checked her watch with the precision of someone whose time was measured in billable hours and whose patience had limits that coincided exactly with her professional schedule. Other diners glanced occasionally toward her table, sensing the tension that radiated from the corner where the critic sat in judgment. The restaurant's reputation hung in the balance of whatever would emerge from those kitchen doors. Marcus had positioned himself at the pass, his face pale with the knowledge that his career was walking toward its potential destruction, in the hands of a server who trembled slightly as she balanced the unadorned bowl on her silver tray. The rest of the kitchen staff had found excuses to cluster near the small window that offered a view of the dining room, their professional composure fractured by the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. Elias stood slightly apart from the others, his hands still bearing the honest stains of his rebellion. The expensive dessert he had abandoned sat forgotten under the heat lamps, its sugar sculptures melting slowly into abstract shapes that seemed to comment on the fragility of artificial perfection. He felt strangely calm, as if he had finally aligned his actions with something fundamental that had been missing from his professional life. The server reached Dame Ashworth's table and set down the bowl with the reverence typically reserved for religious ceremonies. The critic looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from mild impatience to confusion as she registered the humble offering before her. This was not the elaborate finale she had expected. There was no presentation to photograph, no complex composition to analyze, no technical innovation to critique. Dame Ashworth lifted her spoon, not the special dessert implement that had been set for the planned final course, but a simple soup spoon that seemed almost foreign in this setting of calculated elegance. The dining room held its breath. Through the kitchen window, an entire staff watched their fate being decided by a woman whose opinion could reshape careers with a single paragraph. She took a small sip, her face maintaining the professional neutrality that had made her reviews legendary for their objectivity. But something flickered across her features so quickly that only the most observant watcher might have caught it. Her hand paused halfway back to the bowl, the spoon trembling almost imperceptibly. Dame Ashworth took another taste, larger this time, and then another. The calculated composure that had defined her public persona for 3 decades began to crack like ice in warm water. The soup was nothing special by the standards of technical cuisine, just lentils and vegetables and herbs, combined with the kind of intuitive seasoning that home cooks had mastered for centuries. But it carried something that none of the evening's previous courses had possessed: the unmistakable taste of someone who had cooked with love rather than ambition. The critic set down her spoon and pressed her napkin to her lips, but not before several observers noticed the shine of moisture in her eyes. The dining room remained frozen in anticipation, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding before them. Dame Ashworth, the woman who had built her reputation on surgical precision and emotional distance, was crying. She stood abruptly from her table, her chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent restaurant. Instead of heading toward the exit as everyone expected, she walked with purposeful steps toward the kitchen doors. The maitre d' moved to intercept her, but she waved him away with the authority of someone unaccustomed to being denied access to anything she wished to see. The kitchen doors swung open, and Dame Ashworth entered the professional domain that few critics ever witnessed. The staff scattered like startled birds, but Elias remained at his station, meeting her gaze with the calm acceptance of someone who had already made peace with the consequences of his choices. She approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the non-slip flooring, until she stood directly before the man who had dared to serve her soup instead of spectacle. For a long moment neither spoke. The kitchen equipment hummed around them, the only sound in a space that had fallen into complete silence. "What's your name?" she asked finally, her voice softer than anyone in the kitchen had ever heard it. "Elias Rodriguez," he replied simply. Dame Ashworth nodded, as if filing away information that would prove important later. "That soup," she began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed inadequate to express what she was feeling. "It reminded me of someone I haven't thought about in 40 years, someone who used to make me feel safe." She paused, looking around the kitchen that represented everything modern gastronomy had become: technical, innovative, impressive, and somehow lacking the fundamental warmth that had drawn her to food writing in the first place. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised everyone listening. "I'm sorry that I forgot why food matters. I'm sorry that I stopped looking for the heart in what I was tasting." The apology hung in the air like a revelation, transforming not just the moment, but the entire understanding of what had transpired. Dame Ashworth had not come to destroy careers or deliver harsh judgment. She had come to acknowledge that somewhere in her pursuit of professional excellence, she had lost touch with the simple human truth that the best food is always a gift from the heart of the cook to the soul of the person being fed. Elias nodded, accepting her apology with the grace of someone who understood that both of them had been searching for the same thing without realizing it. In serving his mother's soup, he had reminded the critic of who she used to be before ambition had hardened her heart. In accepting his offering, she had reminded him why he had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. The kitchen remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of recognition, of understanding that they had all just witnessed something that would change how they thought about their craft forever.